Thanks everyone, and a warm welcome to this webinar, which is jointly hosted by JSA and Clifford Chance. I am Vikram Raghani. I'm going to moderate the discussion today. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping points. I think this platform allows you as the listeners to pose questions in a Q&A chat room. So as we go along, please feel free to post your questions. I will try and answer them as we move along, or in the end, we have reserved about 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so to answer these questions. So with that, let's get started. The idea is that we're going to keep this as more as a free-flowing discussion amongst the panelists. So today's topic is the recent announcement by the Indian government to allow Indian companies to directly list their shares on offshore exchanges. As you are all aware, until now, Indian companies have been allowed to list on offshore exchanges indirectly through the depository mechanism using ADRs and GDRs, which were quite popular, say in the 90s or even in the early 2000s. But now this reform will allow Indian companies to access and get their shares directly listed on offshore exchanges. So from a Indian capital markets perspective, this is quite a big bang reform, if we may call it. And while the reform has come in the context of the sort of COVID stimulus package, the timing could not have been better. I think all of us are aware that Indian companies, especially in the technology and the new age sectors like retail, etc., have seen a lot of global interest from marquee investors. And from an investor standpoint, it would be great to have an exit opportunity like this, where the shares of the Indian companies could be listed directly on the offshore exchanges. So it's no doubt a great reform. I think the question is, how quickly can it be implemented? This will require close coordination in India amongst various regulators. You have SEBI, you have RBI, you have the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and of course there are a number of questions. What does it mean for promoters? What does it mean for Indian companies? On what basis do they choose listing in India versus listing abroad? What are the various consequences, ramifications? Each of these issues will have implications in India and will obviously have implications in the offshore jurisdiction also, where the shares are being listed. And therefore, to decode all of this, we thought we must have a balanced perspective, both from an India and offshore perspective. And to do that, we have a great panel today. Let me just quickly introduce the panel before we get started. We have from JSA, Lalit Kumar and Orko Mukherjee. Lalit specializes in corporate law and corporate commercial transactions like M&A, private equity. Orko focuses on capital market transactions. From Clifford Chance, we have Rahul Guptan and Johannes Ute. Rahul leads Clifford Chance's India-focused capital markets team based in Singapore, and Johannes specializes in US federal securities law. So a warm welcome to all of you, including the panelists, and let's get started with this topic. So the foundation of this reform was really laid by SEBI in December 2018. They had constituted an expert committee which has come out with a detailed report on direct offshore listing by Indian companies. And the catalyst very recently has been the Companies Amendment Bill, where there is a proposal to amend Section 23 of the Companies Act to set the ball in motion as far as implementing this direct listing opportunity is concerned. So Lalit, let's start with you. It will be helpful to get your thoughts on the framework that is proposed and what are the contours of this direct listing which has been proposed by SEBI.
Thank you, Vikram, and good evening, everyone. So as Vikram said, it's a very big bang reform. The SEBI's committee was constituted and it submitted its report in 2018. So the SEBI committee has gone into various aspects. If you read the report, it says it has gone into the economic case, the legal, operational, regulatory case to bring these recommendations, and also it has laid down the constraints. So basically, the recommendation and proposal is that direct listing of Indian companies' equity shares on foreign stock exchanges. Now, there are two things here. One is the listing of the Indian companies in the foreign exchanges, and also there are only certain permissible jurisdictions. Now, in the report, the recommendation was that it can't be that all the foreign exchanges and all the countries and jurisdictions should be allowed. So there was a basis. One of the important criteria, as was highlighted in the report, was those jurisdictions which have treaty sharing, information sharing treaty with India, and they would also allow, if Indian authorities tomorrow want to do investigation and ask for cooperation, then those countries and those jurisdictions should allow that. Keeping that as the basis, one of the important basis, so the committee made recommendations, and around 10 countries and 10 jurisdictions and certain stock exchanges within those jurisdictions have been listed, I think, which we will cover as we go along. Now, what does it cover? So it will cover both the Indian companies which are already listed and also the Indian unlisted company. I think it's a good move, and more importantly for the unlisted Indian companies. Now, it does not need them to be first listed in Indian stock exchanges like the Bombay Stock Exchange or the National Stock Exchange. They can go for the listing directly through this route. And the securities which have been proposed, as Vikram was mentioning, ADR and GDRs are a different concept. So here, the securities which have been proposed are equity shares. Interestingly, because the securities will be still Indian securities, although the report is not very specifically mentioning, so it will be the securities to be denominated in Indian rupees, and it will not be a foreign currency securities. An important aspect, although you may be aware, but still we thought it is better that we mention that it will only cover aspects related to companies only, not the other form of entities like LLP, because LLPs in any case cannot issue equity shares and cannot go for listing even in India. So this is restricted to only companies, although FDI is permitted in LLPs, but that's not the scope of this recommendation. The report also goes into, although it hasn't gone into much detail, into tax aspects and also aspects related to accounting and accounting standards, and have left it for the Department of Revenue to recommend and make suggestions regarding the tax aspects. On two important things, the KYC norms and the anti-money laundering aspects. So what the committee said that these jurisdictions are very advanced. They have already proven capital markets and deep capital markets, and they have stringent regulations around that. So there will be no specific and separate norms for KYC compliances and even the anti-money laundering compliances, and the standards set by these jurisdictions will be well accepted.
Thanks, Lalit. That's useful. Rahul, some quick opening remarks from you in terms of how this is going to be perceived in the offshore jurisdictions.
Thanks, Vikram, and thanks, Lalit, for that introduction. I'm glad to be here as part of this panel. I think the concept of Indian companies accessing international capital markets has always been something that's very interesting. Starting from the 90s, you've had different companies undertake equity raising, opportunities in foreign markets. London, NASDAQ, NYSE are the typical exchanges where you've seen this. And there's been an ebb and flow from the Indian regulatory landscape that's permitted this in some form or manner, and then basically shut the route down in its entirety. So I think for a certain quality of Indian company that's looking to access a certain type of capital and wanting to get benchmarked against a peer group of companies that may not necessarily exist in India, this is a great opportunity. I think exchanges across the world have been quite keen to get Indian company and Indian paper listed on their exchanges. NASDAQ, NYSE, London Stock Exchange routinely used to do the rounds of the regulators in India and of the unlisted companies in India, as well as certain blue chip Indian corporates, trying to see how they could come and access markets. So if this change happens and when it happens, I think it would be quite a landmark reform. I think with everything in India and particularly linked to these sorts of amendments, the devil will be in the detail. We've seen legislation come out and it takes up to a year or 2 years for the first transaction to happen post that. And for something as complicated as this, which is allowing direct access to markets by listing Indian rupee denominated shares on an offshore exchange, with the myriad sets of regulations, laws that need to be changed and amended or work together, I think we'll all be cautiously optimistic for this reform. But if and when it happens, it will definitely be something that would interest in investment bankers, lawyers, exchanges, regulators around the world, just because of the quality of Indian paper and Indian companies that could access this route when it's available.
Thanks, Rahul. I think you're right. It's the devil is in the detail, and sounds like I think the offshore jurisdictions or the exchanges would have seen other countries, other Southeast Asian countries, list their shares on those exchanges. So I think from a regulatory setup perspective, like you mentioned, in India there is a whole web of regulations and various regulators that will have to speak to each other and make sure that sort of the road is cleaned up towards implementing this. So Orko, what are your thoughts on some of the key changes that this will necessitate? The good sort of part is that there is already some form of draft amendment, say whether it's the non-debt rules or in the form of the company's amendment bill, that is already underway, and we've sort of seen some finer details. So it will be good to get your thoughts on what these amendments are going to be. Are there more needed, and therefore how soon can these be put to work? Sorry, Orko, we can't hear you. Can you just?
Sorry, there was some technical thing. Thank you, Vikram. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Rahul, and thank you, Lalit, for the wonderful introduction. To enable offshore listing of a foreign company, the key amendments would, of course, as you mentioned, would be the Exchange Control Laws, the Companies Act, and of course the SEBI disclosure regulations. Now, the exchange control in this sphere is currently governed by the Foreign Exchange Management Non-Debt Instrument Rules 2019, which replaces the erstwhile FEMA transfer issue of securities by a person resident regulation, which was colloquially known as FEMA 20 in the bankers and in the lawyer circles. Towards this end, specific amendment is required under Rule 6 of the NDI rules. Rule 6 primarily dictates investments by person resident in India. Outside India. Rule 6 specifies that a non-resident may deal in any capital instrument only in the manner as specified in Schedule 1 thereto. Now, the Schedule 1 has gone under several amendments, as we know historically, and this Schedule 1 contemplate and allow subscription of India incorporated equity shares by non-residents subject to sectoral caps, and it does not specifically allow issuance of equity shares that are to be listed on a foreign stock exchange and held by non-residents. The current structure that we are discussing, although Schedule 1 talks about sectoral caps and FDI and the fact that whether it will be an approval route, prohibited sectors, those sort of nuances have been detailed out, but it still does not specifically allow the listing of shares of an Indian company offshore. So maybe a Part B even that was the proposal in the SEBI report, that the Part B be created where FDI is defined, where how the whole mechanism of a non-resident holding Indian equity shares would be sort of disclosed. So as we know, Reserve Bank of India is the key regulator for exchange controls in India. Therefore, it needs to amend Schedule 1. And that Schedule 1 needs to be amended in a manner that will not sort of take away the sectoral caps that we have, not sort of compromise on the prohibited sector, and also, have the same route under government route investments that we currently have, which is also called the, the automatic route and the approval route. For approval route or the government route investments, as we need to sort of, as it is commonly known in the regulatory parlance, they need to specify the manner of obtaining such permission. For instance, will that be a one-time approval? Will that be a recurring one? Is it to be done on a threshold basis? So those and what will happen to the prohibited sector? Will every time do the regulations need to be amended or an application made to RBI? Because ultimately we have to bear in mind that it's going to be a marketable security. So every time if one would have to apply to the regulator, that may not be absolutely kosher, or it might sort of lead to practical difficulties. So a broad framework or even a policy by the RBI, needs to come out on top of the Schedule 1 amendment to Rule 6. Also, the other question which begs to be asked is whether whether it will be a non-repat transaction. In that sense, as for the Indian equity shares are concerned, will the the sort of money being allowed to go out? What will be the FDI limit and all of that? Currently, the SEBI report as well as is completely silent on that, and so is the RBI. So we'll have to, so a little bit of work needs to be done on that sphere. Also, these FDI investments, if they are treated as a definition of FDI as per the SEBI report that's been defined, needs to be exempt from current pricing guidelines. Because the idea, and it will be, it will be attractive if a free pricing regime like we have for an IPO is allowed. Also, the receipt and retention of proceeds should be permitted in foreign currency account, and consequent to that, the foreign currency account regulations needs to be amended. However, another interesting point I think Rahul touched to an extent, and I think Lalit also mentioned, that is it the contemplation that the Indian residents are allowed to invest in these capital instruments at all, by any direct route, indirect route? That seems to be completely silent. It does not prohibit, not allow in the current report and in the sort of the current amendments that has been proposed. If it is yes, if it is quite natural for us to sort of from the capital market augmentation and from a shareholder value, for Indian listed or unlisted shareholder value, if Indian shareholders are to be allowed to invest and take the benefit of the listing offshore, then the LRS scheme, which is known as the liberalized remittance scheme, is that the appropriate route? That needs to be that begs the answer. Whether that
I think it's interesting that you raised this, because there's already a query raised from the audience on this topic. So I think the current framework that is proposed doesn't seem to contemplate this facility or this platform being available for Indian residents or Indian corporates. So I think if that is going to be the ultimate aim, that will necessitate some more changes in FEMA. But coming to the exchanges itself, Rahul, there is a list of about 10 to 12 exchanges in 10 jurisdictions that have been identified. Based on your experience with other sort of similar situations, any specific thoughts on which ones are likely to be the preferred ones? Where do you see certain challenges? Like, for example, there is one of the exchanges is Shanghai. Now, in the current context of India-China relations, and with this press note 3 in some sense creating havoc for sort of investors which have significant Chinese interest, I would think that is going to be an upfront challenge, right? Because if you're trying to list in Shanghai, most of your investors are going to be from China. But that's an Indian sort of nuanced issue. But your thoughts on these exchanges, and there are some notable omissions, so it will be good to hear from you on this.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to try and stay away from the nuclear bomb that is India-China relations. and stick to talking about the exchanges in the SEBI report. So I think the obvious ones in the SEBI report are NASDAQ, NYSE, and London. Those three are traditionally very well regarded exchanges. Indian companies have gone and accessed capital in all of those three jurisdictions quite easily, and you do have a few blue chip companies listed there. I think when it comes to an issuer and an investment bank advising an issuer as to which jurisdiction or market to go to, there's two things you're looking at. One is you're looking at where's the best place where you're going to get the most lucrative valuation, and where is the most deep pool of capital that you can access. And I think that's really going to be the determination even today with this extended list of exchanges that SEBI has identified. So if there's a pool of capital and if there is quality investors, and the third aspect, I guess, is quality benchmarking, where you have other similar companies in the same industry listed on those exchanges, then those are going to be the exchanges that are going to be the clear winners. Some of them that are listed there, which are, I think, going to be a challenge, Shanghai, Hong Kong Stock Exchange, I think Osaka's listed there. I think in some of those places, you're going to have challenges which are local regulatory issues in terms of having to prepare different types of prospectuses or prospectuses that are specific for consumption in those local markets. Whereas when you're comparing that to NASDAQ, NYSE, London, it's probably a more streamlined process. And in terms of companies from other jurisdictions looking to list, NASDAQ, NYSE, London, I think probably have quite an advantage in comparison to some of the other exchanges in the SEBI report, and having proper rules and regulations, as well as a track record of attracting issuers from different parts of the world to come and list there. They also have, not just direct listings in the form of equity shares from different countries listed there, but also ADRs and other depository receipt products listed on those exchanges. So I think comparatively, those three are going to be the clear winners and will be places that will attract the most amount of interest from India. I think the notable exception that SEBI's left out, and which would be very interesting if we could pick SEBI's brain as to why it's not on that list, is the Singapore Stock Exchange. Because traditionally, at least for various types of debt instruments, and back in the middle of the 2000s, there was fair interest from replicating business trust IPOs in Singapore. So Singapore's been quite a traditional hub for Indian paper. So why that has been left out is a very interesting question. And I think it is something that probably in the final regulations may get fixed. But I would think SEBI should relook at the exclusion of Singapore from that list.
Thanks, Rahul. There is a question from the audience on which countries currently allow this kind of a direct listing. So just a quick sort of input on that.
So I think it's going to be tough for me to pinpoint and talk about specific countries, but I think the concept that would have to be tested in each jurisdiction is whether or not in each country and each jurisdiction that's looking to do this, is there full capital and current account convertibility of that currency? And if there is full capital and current account convertibility, then absolutely there are no reasons why a company from that particular jurisdiction or country cannot then go and do a listing of securities directly in the jurisdiction, in any of these offshore jurisdictions. So if you look at London, you have a host of investments, a host of issuers from continental Europe who have their securities listed and traded on the London Stock Exchange. Similarly, if you look at NASDAQ and NYSE, you have a whole host of companies from South America, from China, from India, who have different forms of their securities listed and traded on those exchanges.
Got it. And I think it's interesting you point out in terms of the direct sort of the shares, the listing by various countries, and I'm going to have a specific question on that. But before that, a quick remark also on the IFC being left out of the list. I mean, that was a big. The government was quite keen to project GIFT City as an international finance center, but that seems to have been left out of the list. Is that something? Do you think IFC has a case to push for an inclusion as far as this list is concerned?
Yeah, it's Vikram. It's surprising because the IFC is one of those who also is a member of the ISCO and the FATS. Those are the two sort of basic criteria that you need to meet if you are the permissible list of jurisdictions. Also, the debt securities as well as something like a masala bond and FCCBs of Indian companies are currently allowed to be listed in that gift city. Which is the Indian INX, as you call it, or the NSE IFC. Those are the two platforms. Now, I think the anomaly on law is that the SEBI guidelines, the SEBI IFC guidelines, do not talk about Indian equity shares as a permissible security. I think there's an anomaly because Indian equity shares of an Indian company can be traditionally mean to be the Indian sort of the domestic shares. Now, since it is going to be listed offshore, so it should be treated in par with the offshore security. SEBI has the power under Section 11 of the SEBI Act to amend this particular definition of permissible securities. They should do that and allow the gift city to be a permissible jurisdiction, because that would encourage and facilitate Indian capital markets to compete with the international stock exchanges and bring in quality infrastructure, and that will give a big boost to the capital markets. To the Indian capital markets, as far as the whole sort of the shareholder value will be great in that sense. So that's my view. I think SEBI should make an amendment to the definition, and this should be a list.
Thanks. So Rahul, coming back to you, I think what seems to have been proposed is that Indian companies will issue a different class of shares only to certain non-resident investors, and those will then get listed on some of these exchanges. So you could have a situation where an Indian company, as far as India is concerned, is purely unlisted, but has this separate class of shares listed outside. Or you can have a dual listing kind of a scenario where you have these shares listed both on offshore exchanges and Indian exchanges. So based on what you have seen in other jurisdictions, how do you think this plays out? What is better from an issuer's perspective? Because a dual listing can get pretty complicated. Indian companies have their own securities laws to deal with, plus they'll have a whole new sort of regulations applicable to them as well. So just some thoughts on what's the kind of structure that you have seen for these kind of listings, and how does that sort of play out elsewhere, because India is most likely to borrow from the learnings and the experiences abroad. So some sort of thoughts on that.
Sure. I think with regard to something like this, whenever we speak to issuers or investment banks, I think the request that's always stated to us is, let's keep it as simple as possible and not complicate the structure. If you have a scenario where you are effectively having offshore shares that are traded offshore and are a different class or a different structure or a different rights package compared to ordinary equity shares in India, it is going to raise a significant amount of questions about how do these securities operate, what do the investors in these securities get access to, what happens to their rights entitlement, how do they vote on matters, is their vote the same as the equity shares vote? So there's all manners of challenges and questions that will arise if we have this separate dual class structure of offshore shares listed and traded offshore, and onshore shares which are in India. And I think you can then further complicate the matter even further if you have offshore shares listed and traded on NASDAQ and onshore shares listed and traded on BSE/NSE. And you then add another degree of complication to it, where you have that Indian investors cannot buy the offshore shares, but can only trade the onshore shares. but an investor sitting in New York who has a FII/FPI account can trade the onshore equity shares on BSE, NSE, and trade the offshore shares on NASDAQ/NYSE. So I think if SEBI is contemplating that you create a new category of securities for the accessing of the offshore market and trading on the offshore market compared to what you do onshore in India, I think that is going to throw up a fair degree of complication and is very honestly going to be a lawyer's and investment banker's dream come true trying to structure the first such deal. And I think the first issuer or the first few issuers who sign up for this are going to pay the price for that. That's not to say that it can't be done. It's just to say that I think it would make what would otherwise be a fairly straightforward IPO a very complicated IPO.
Yeah.
I think in our experience looking at other markets, we typically would expect that most issuers who are doing this would have a clean route to go and list their securities offshore in the market that they choose to list. So they may not have the same kinds of complications that come out of India. And if there was an alternative that where you could not list the underlying equity shares directly, I think an ADR or a GDR type structure, a depository receipt structure, would be most commonly accessed in those scenarios. Johannes, I don't know if you want to add to that in any form or manner from what you've seen on the deals you looked at.
Hey, Rahul, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Glad that finally worked. Apologies for the tardiness in my joining, but no, not much to add. I think that's absolutely right. We did a real dual listing with the same shares many years ago in Indonesia and Singapore, and we thought that would really, just to your point, Rahul, about the first company trying to do something like that, really paying the price of doing it. That was Berlian Laju Tanker back in the day, listing in both Jakarta and Singapore. That's about 15 years or so ago. And it was very, very complicated in trying to get the deal done. We thought that it would really kickstart a movement of companies, primarily Indonesian companies, listing in both Jakarta and Singapore. And BLT ended up being the only one, and then also going bust for various other reasons. But that's really never translated into any major movement on that front. So I share your skepticism, Rahul, in terms of the developments on that front for real sort of either dual listings and certainly two different classes.
I think that's an interesting observation, because what that means is then, at least from an investor standpoint for Indian companies, I think then the earlier point that someone made, that the current platform or the current framework doesn't seem to allow Indian investors to access the offshore platform. So I think that then becomes an important reform, because if the preferred sort of structure, or the preferred and the cleanest route is for Indian companies to list on the offshore exchange and not attempt this complicated dual listing structure, there has to be a regulatory way of allowing Indian investors to also avail, because ultimately this is going to be a very good form of exit opportunities that's going to find its way in most investment documents, and we sort of come to that a bit later. But then the discrepancy, or rather the differentiation, where only foreign investors will be allowed to take the benefit of this offshore listing and Indian investors may be left behind. I think that's going to then play up at some point, and maybe the Indian regulators will have to deal with it. So Johannes, maybe a follow-up question in terms of, there is either you can simply list these shares directly on the exchanges, or you will have Indian companies go through the full sort of IPO, full underwritten process. What are these? Are both these avenues available, or because the shares are not already listed in India, are the exchanges offshore going to insist on a full IPO process?
Thanks, Vikram. You're referring to the direct floor listing process from the US perspective. Is that right? The Spotify example, for example.
Correct. That's correct. Like the Spotify example, you're right.
Yeah. Thanks for raising that. So, I mean, the very short answer to your question is that yes, either route, a full traditional IPO or a direct listing would be available. I don't think the U.S. regulators would insist on the shares being listed elsewhere beforehand. Just to take a quick step back, perhaps, I mean, the direct listing, just to make sure we use our terminology correctly, the U.S. use of the term direct listing, I do think is different from SEBI's. And it's fairly new in the U.S. But so the concept of direct listing, as I think you've already alluded to, in the U.S. allows a company to list its shares on an exchange without going through the full underwriting and market building process that you see on a traditional IPO. So the company would go directly. Ultimately, the initial trading price is determined in the first auction period of the morning of listing. And the company avoids, there is no underwriting, there is no roadshow, no traditional sort of marketing process that you see in an IPO. There is also not, at least for the time being, there is not any capital raise involved. So it's not for every company, and certainly a company that's in a serious growth phase and needs capital may not find it particularly useful. Really is for companies who want to enjoy the benefits of being listed, the liquidity, using the shares as acquisition tools, et cetera, but don't necessarily need the capital. The NYSE has just proposed rules to also allow for a primary capital raise as part of a direct listing, but for the time being, that's not the case yet. So that's a big difference, and I think what that means is it really just limits the universe of companies for whom a direct listing is of interest. I think you probably need a company like Spotify is a good example with very significant market recognition, a company that, as I mentioned, doesn't need immediate capital, and who doesn't need the book building process, who thinks it can go out into the market and immediately start trading based on its name recognition, based on investor understanding of the company and its ability to essentially sell itself in the market. So again, back to your question, I think that route is available for Indian companies, but presumably only for a fairly small set, at least until the rules change and a primary capital raise is involved as well. I think most market observers expect direct listings, U.S. direct listings, to be fairly rare until that rule change, and then we may see a real change in the market.
Got it. Thanks, Johannes. Orko, while we are on that topic, a quick few thoughts on, I think Rahul mentioned and Johannes also agrees that it's going to be fairly complex to have a dual listing structure. I think, do you share that concern from an Indian securities laws perspective also? Because there will be some conflicts. How does an Indian company go about it? Do you then comply with the strictest requirement applicable across both? So just a few quick comments on that, and then we move on to the next issue.
Sure. I think Indian listed entities, which are cross-listed overseas, shall need to be parallelly be in compliance of and have to adhere to SEBI prescribed regulations. Now, therefore, the regulator will have to come through a detailed mapping as to what are the differences between those jurisdictions and the compliance with the Indian regulations. It will be very challenging for an Indian company to actually comply with two sets of policy framework. There needs to be robust policies need to be built to resolve such situations. Obviously, this will be this initially would be an evolving legislation, which may require swift action, including changes to Indian security laws of insider trading, LODR, etc. Also, another point I wanted to make that if you really allow Indian shareholders, Indian listed shareholders to sort of take the advantage of the listed equity shares of offshore, then one would need to figure out what is the mode of placement that will be. Do we have a normal rule 1440 type or 42 exemption, where those equity shares will in fact be treated as an private class of shares or a private placement, and I mean, and therefore not require the registration of prospectus, or there would be no SEBI filing. And also whether the cap in such private placements needs to be 200 investors, and what would the disclosure requirement be? I mean, do we need to have an international wrap? Whether that wrap will be registered? Those sort of questions, there is some bit of work to be done. I think we are still at the initial stages, and those regulations need to be developed. That's all from us on this.
Got it. Thanks. So, guys, I mean, I think one question that everyone has is, what does this really mean for ADRs and GDRs? I think those were quite popular in the 90s and maybe even early 2000s. They ran into some regulatory challenges on issues such as round tripping, etc., etc. But now, if this was to be implemented, where you no longer really need a depository mechanism, is it really the end of the road for ADRs and GDRs? Or maybe Rahul, you can take this first. Are there still significant considerations for Indian companies to explore ADRs, GDRs versus direct listing? Maybe, I don't know, if an Indian listed company doesn't want to deal with some of these complications, would they still find ADRs, GDRs more attractive, or what would be the deciding factors on this issue?
Sure, thanks, Vikram. I think very quickly I'm going to pick up from what Johannes spoke about earlier, which is the SEBI report's use of the phrase direct listing, quote unquote, is very different from what Johannes spoke about as a Spotify example of direct listing. I think if you go back to the history of these regulations and how they've evolved since 1993, when the first SEBI, rather Ministry of Finance guidelines on FCCBs, ADRs, GDRs came out, the effect has always been to try and stop a flight of capital out of India. That has been the reason behind all of these regulations. And to make the Indian markets the preferred choice of a quality Indian blue chip company accessing capital, they should look at BSE and NSE first. So I think if you're moving away from that principle and you're then going to say that, okay, if today there is an Infosys, or today there is Reliance Jio, or today there is some unknown biotech company that's sitting on a kind of a patent that's going to blow the world away, and they want to do an IPO, we want to give them full benefit to go to any market in the world. And we don't want to have to amend and change 50 different laws to permit that. Then I think the easiest route is to come up with a comprehensive scheme to allow ADRs and GDRs once again, because the depository receipt structure is fairly straightforward. It's been done and dusted multiple times over. Indian companies have accessed it. It's a simple, straightforward methodology to access a market without having to go through all of the pain that we're talking about in the SEBI quote unquote direct listing mantra. So you can allow an Indian company to be only listed on NASDAQ with Indian equity shares using ADRs. So I don't see why they've deviated from that principle with this. There used to be a historical debate as to whether ADRs trade at a discount or trade at a premium to the underlying equity shares of companies that were, that had both DRs and equity shares. And it used to be the case in specifically for some Indian corporates that the equity shares would trade at a premium or at a discount to the DRs. And the DRs traded at a significant premium to the underlying equity shares. And the reason for that was that there was a simple demand and supply, that there was more supply of the equity shares in India and a restricted pool of DRs available in the offshore market. But SEBI went and the government went and fixed that by allowing two-way fungibility between the DRs and the shares. So effectively, you could swap in and out between your DRs and shares. It was still complicated to do, but it could theoretically be done. And once that happened, you actually saw that discount or premium kind of disappear between the DRs and the underlying equity shares. So I think there's a lot that could be done to fix this, and we would then be doing these deals maybe 6 months down the line as compared to 1 year down the line if we had went down this dual share structure. So I think there's still quite a lot of merit in looking at the ADR GDR structure. I think there is some element of a black mark linked to certain types of these DR deals. And Orko, maybe you want to talk about that, because there have been significant cases where SEBI has gone in and examined a DR structure and said, oh, actually, this was a round tripping structure or something like that, which throws up a different set of issues. But I think that's just something that is a different issue. It's not a problem with the structure itself.
Just to thank you, Rahul. Just to take that forward and just to give you some data points and with the audience some data points. In 2017, SEBI actually barred 19 domestic and foreign firms, from the security market, and there were at least 26 entities that were barred by the European American Investment Bank also. And there were a lot of widespread warnings and the fact that there were investigations and they were warned against future dealings in the India market. The misuse of GDRs have been rampant. That is unfortunately, while SEBI is still investigating 50 individuals and companies now for routing black money back in India. There was a lot, so I can take some name of companies. It's quite public. In the public domain, SEBI has imposed a 10-year ban on certain companies, so that is a real concern which the regulator has. Apart from the fungibility issue, the taxation complications, the fact that retail may not be able to participate. Together with the fact that there is no real branding and advertising happens in a GDR ADR. So apart from those commercial and slightly structural issues, I think that SEBI and if you see post 2015, I think only 12 companies have gone through this route. As far as India is concerned. So I think this is a serious concern for us to stop round tripping. Because SEBI is still investigating 50 companies and has barred 19 domestic and foreign firms.
Maybe that's part of the issue that they may have weighed in coming up with this new proposal. A quick time check. I think we have 10 minutes, so let's take a quick couple of questions and then we'll move on to the questions raised by the audience. So Johannes, maybe I think assuming Indian companies do find this attractive in terms of direct listing, and assuming we don't go down this complicated dual listing route but just list on an offshore exchange, there will be several issues that the Indian companies will have to consider. For instance, there is a whole concept of promoter in India. There may be similar sponsor related requirements in offshore exchanges. There'll be eligibility criteria, marketing requirements, shareholder activism, etc. So it will be good for the audience and the listeners if you can walk them through some of the key requirements that Indian companies should be mindful of before deciding to go down this listing path.
Sure, happy to. Thank you. Look, obviously I'll speak mostly from the US perspective and things to think about when you list in the US or if you're considering listing in the US. And I think Rahul touched on some of them earlier when he spoke about the choices between the different exchanges. And obviously, ultimately, the commercial drivers are probably what will really drive the decision. The legal points, I guess it's then up to us lawyers to try to figure out the legal points and make sure that they work. But so I do think obviously valuation and things like customer base and clients and where do you want to raise capital, where do you want to be seen, where do you want to put your where do you want to have your center of gravity in terms of your capital markets presence. Those are primary considerations. From a legal perspective, with regard to the US, obviously, I think the main issue really always has been the liability aspect. Obviously, we have a punitive damages regime in the US. We have a very aggressive plaintiffs bar, and then the various US securities laws. So I think anytime an issuer considers listing in the US, they need to think about the liability, the potential liability, the pressures on their management, combined, of course, with the SEC registration process, with the ongoing reporting process, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's worth flagging that over the last certainly 10 years or more, we've seen the SEC really give much more deference to home country practice for foreign issuers. So again, to the extent an Indian company is considering, say, London or New York for listing, the US is really trying to make an effort and has tried to make an effort for the last 10 plus years to be more competitive and be more friendly toward foreign issuers. That was very different when I started practice, not to date myself or anything, but back in those days, the attitude was still very much, hey, if you want to list in the US, you better follow our rules. Thankfully, I think they've generally deviated from that practice, but still, obviously, the registration process and the ongoing reporting requirements are something that people should keep in mind. And we and other firms, of course, we have a whole booklets on things like that we can run through with people to make sure that everybody is comfortable with that. A couple of other points to flag, I think, are just things like insider trading rules. Again, the U.S. is a where those rules are both a little bit unclear. That's probably true in most places, but certainly in the U.S. But then again, you're obviously also oftentimes faced with very aggressive regulators, very aggressive prosecutors, and so in a legal environment that can be uncomfortable for issuers. And then one other point I would flag: there's no restriction on the nationality, so to speak of companies listing in the U.S. The only aspect where that can be relevant is really with regard to sanctions and things like that. So again, a very aggressive U.S. regime in terms of sanctions. And so if you're an Indian company and a large chunk of your business is, for example, in the Middle East, then that you really should think about whether listing in the U.S. is something that's an attractive option for your business ultimately going forward.
Thanks, Johannes. That's helpful. Rahul, any comments from a non-US perspective? And also, there are lots of questions from various members in the audience on how something like takeover offers and how would some of those kind of issues pan out if this was listed on an offshore exchange. So maybe your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I think there's two concepts here. One is if you're dual listed, if you're listed on BSE, NSE, and you're listed on NASDAQ, NYSE, or an offshore exchange, then you have this whole conflict scenario that you have to be concerned about, because you have the local laws in India that you have to comply with, as well as laws that are applicable to you because of by virtue of your listing in an offshore jurisdiction. And there, really, the thumb rule that we would tend to follow is that the strictest rule is the rule that you have to comply with. So if there's a conflict between corporate governance requirements, or there's conflicts between disclosure requirements, takeover requirements, I think we just apply the thumb rule that one is first look at what the home country rule is. If that's not the primary rule, then you look to see which is the more onerous obligation, and you have to comply with that. So that's one comment I want to make. I think there's also still some amount of confusion about this concept of direct listing. So again, I just want to clarify for everybody that the words direct listing as used in the SEBI regulation or SEBI report is a bit different from what Johannes was speaking about as direct listing. What Johannes was speaking about direct listing is a US concept which allows you to become a listed and traded company on the stock exchange without having to do an IPO, without having to put out raise capital from investors and have lead managers and underwriters and things like that. Not do a traditional IPO, but automatically on one day become traded on a stock exchange in the US. That is what SEBI is talking about when they're talking about direct listing, is to talk about accessing an international market without having to list in India first. So there's two different concepts at play over there. So I think there were some questions on that. So I'll just clarify that.
Sure, thanks. Lalit, coming to you, I think there is, going to be a change in the manner in which, say, our shareholder agreements or investment agreements are written, because clearly some of the investors, as and when this is implemented, may have a preference towards insisting that their exit should be structured by way of this form of a direct listing. Whereas at least it looks like as of now, Indian investors may not be able to aware of that. So for an Indian promoter, your thoughts on how this is likely to pan out?
Sure, Vikram. I think, a lot has been said earlier about the Indian resident and Indian shareholders not able to participate. I feel this will have a lot of impact on the exit. Because if you see, typically, whether it is a PE exit or even in a joint venture, partners want to exit, or even simply the shareholders of Indian company want to exit. So what will happen is all the PE, by the way, all the PE agreements and investments agreement that we have been writing so far, we always write a concept of recognized stock exchange. And in that concept, we do say Indian listing, Indian stock exchanges, Bombay, NSE, but we do write international stock exchanges as per the applicable law. So perhaps, the time has come when, this kind of direct listing in offshore exchanges will be permitted, and our PE clauses which used to anticipate and contemplate will really see light of the day. So coming back to the point, this distinction which we discussed, Vikram, earlier about foreign and Indian shareholders, I'll just emphasize one or two points why it is more clear from the report that this does not apply to Indian listing or Indian shareholders. Even if you see the concept of transfer, the transfer provisions that have been contemplated or provided for as amendment to the NDI rules will talk about the shareholders holding shares, foreign shareholders can only transfer to another non-resident. Now, it doesn't clarify that those shares can be transferred to a resident Indian. Now, the scenario which will play out is if in a situation of an exit, now there is an Indian shareholder, a foreign shareholder, Indian PE fund and a foreign PE fund. So what will happen is, as far as the foreign investor is concerned, definitely that will help them because it allows that window to them. So their shares can be listed. But as far as the Indian shareholders are concerned, there could be a challenge unless and until this is clarified. And I heard also Orcom mentioned about the liberalized remittance scheme. I think, it will need more amendments to the regulation than simply the LRS scheme. The reason being, as you all know, the liberalized scheme is available only to individuals. So what it leaves out is Indian corporates and Indian non-individual entities. So therefore, it will need an amendment in FEMA, and this is a very important principal question. Other point, I think, for exit, which could have a bearing, is one provision which says the funds have to be brought in foreign currency and kept abroad till the time the shares are, till the time the Indian company requires the proceeds. I'm not sure, we'll have to see the fine prints when it comes, that how will it work, because typically when we write the investment agreements, there is a horizon of 4 to 5 years of listing, but the shares are issued upfront. I'm not sure how the shares initially will be issued to the foreign investors in foreign currency and how it will play out for the Indian shareholders also. So therefore, in my view, this really needs amendment or a deeper thinking so that the level playing field can be ensured as far as exit is concerned in the same company where foreign and Indian shareholders are there.
All right, thanks. I think that's an interesting input there. I think there's a fair bit of detailing to be done as far as that is concerned. So I think, gentlemen, we've run out of time. We have hopefully answered most of the questions that have been raised, but if there are more queries, you should be able to see our coordinates on your screen. Please feel free to write to us. Thanks to all the speakers, Rahul, Johannes, Sorko, Lalit, for their interesting insights. I think net takeaway is that it's a fairly attractive proposal, but like Rahul mentioned earlier, devil is in the detail. So I'm sure there will be a lot of detailing and there will be a lot of devils that will probably come out of it. So let's, on that note, thanks everyone for joining in and for listening in. Like I mentioned, we are happy to respond to any queries. Feel free to reach out to us. Thanks everyone. Good evening, stay safe and take care.